Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Andrew Whitehouse, and I'm so happy to be here to be presenting the first of our CliniKids Autism Seminar Series for 2025. We had an amazing sort of program of this seminar series last year, and I was thrilled to be asked to do another one right up front. And this time we've got a really exciting topic talking about autism diagnosis. I hope you're tuning in, so sit back. The idea is that you get a whole lot of information here that you can chew over, and of course there will be a recording of this afterwards as well. How about we get into it? Okay, so that's just the starting slide to say what we're talking about. The topic today is we're talking about navigating an autism diagnosis. One of the questions that I get asked so often is, how do I know when I should be pursuing an assessment for autism? And I get asked quite a lot as to how do you weigh up the pros and cons? And that's really what I want to get through today. Okay. So just to let you know, the seminar goes for about an hour. If you have any questions, please drop them in the chat or the Q&A sort of bit within the Teams function, and they'll come through, and we'll make sure that we have a good 10 or 15 minutes so I can get through the questions. Just drop them in as soon as you have the questions, and they'll be there for me when we finish. At the end of this, we will clean up all the video and edit the video, and we'll make sure to pop it online for your availability so you can also watch it back and also show others if that would be helpful. Right. So I thought, given that we're talking about autism diagnosis, it's really important that we talk about the perspective that I bring. Now, I bring a really unique perspective because I'm me and I'm not you and I'm not other people. And it's really important that you can understand which prism through which I'm actually talking about today. So you can make your own determination as to how you think that might come across. So firstly, I've been a professional in the field for a long time now. I started in the area of autism in about 1999. So gosh, that's about 26 years ago. I originally studied as a speech pathologist, and I worked clinically for a few years as well. I went into research then, so I've really understood the ins and outs of what an autism diagnosis represents in the context of a research and a scientific background as well. And then I've also used that knowledge to just try to drive forward policy. So I've sought to understand not just the clinical aspects of a diagnosis, but what does it mean from the scientific aspects and how that could and should be used in the policy context as well. I think that length of time I've been in the field also really helps in terms of understanding the history, is that my sort of professional life has tracked the modern history of autism from a condition that was very rarely diagnosed. About 1 in every 2,000 children were diagnosed, to now where the diagnosis in Australia is about 1 in every 50. So I've really tracked the trends over time and understand how diagnosis and the waxes and wanes of those diagnoses has contributed to that. And finally, personally, I'm a dad, and certainly I don't have a personal experience of as a father going through the autism diagnosis with any of my children. But of course, like many families, I also bring a disability experience from a first-degree family perspective as well. I am not autistic, and I have not gone through the autism diagnosis with my first-degree family, and so that's also important for you to understand as well. All right, so what's the purpose of the talk? What do I want you to walk away understanding? 3 things. Firstly, I want you to have a really general overview of the diagnostic pathway. What I'm unable to do is to talk to you about what the diagnosis sort of pathway looks like for you in particular, because that changes depending on where you live. But what I can outline is the general parameters of what the process and the pathway is to go to diagnosis, as well as understanding what some of the resources are there for you right now. Secondly, I want to demystify what an autism diagnosis is. I think there's a little bit of mystery and almost a really misunderstanding about what an autism diagnosis represents in 2025. And what I wanted to show you is actually to demystify as to what a diagnosis is and what it is not. Finally, I wanted to provide you a bit of a framework through which it can help you understand and navigate all of those emotions that might be going through your head. And if you're a clinician, I'm providing you a perspective, my perspective, as to ways that I have talked about this throughout the years and how I start to talk about it about now. And of course, that will evolve over time as autism evolves over time. Really importantly, I'm talking about children today. Autism diagnosis can be provided at any age, but the focus of today is really talking about children. So I'll talk a lot about kids and also about parents as well and their caregivers. Okay, so let's talk about the overview of the pathway straight off. Now, as I mentioned, in the context of autism, diagnosis can happen at many, many different ages. You know, we're starting to get really young diagnoses, maybe not at 1, but certainly at 2 or 3 years of age. And often the children that we tend to diagnose at that age have really quite what we call frank behaviours of autism. So really quite apparent that child, it meets criteria for a diagnosis of autism. And it's often, you know, coupled with differences in development that are present really early in life. We also see kids popping up quite a lot at around the ages of 4 or 5, where kids are entering school and the formal requirements of school become even more than what they might experience at home. And we start to understand that kids might be developing different there because of the increased demands on their behaviours. And then finally, we also see another bump in diagnosis, so an increase in the diagnosis in that late primary school and also early high school, actually all throughout high school age, where particularly in the context of females, we start to see adolescents who may have slipped through the net all the way through to that age. And as puberty emerges, we start to see these behaviours that are more consistent with autism really start to emerge. And these are the kind of 3 bumps that we tend to see in terms of the prevalence of autism diagnosis over the years. In Australia, which is where I'm talking from, and I'm aware there's lots of people from around the world tuning in as well. In Australia, the first step for an autism assessment is to contact your primary care health practitioner. In Australia, that's your general practitioner. And that's almost always the first step in seeking to understand whether a diagnostic assessment is worth further investigation. What the GP will then do is refer to a health professional who may have or who will have more specialist skills in the area of neurodevelopmental and autism assessment. In Australia, we're really lucky that we do have a national guideline. Now, what a national guideline does is it sets out this is the standard process through which an autism assessment and a diagnosis should be provided through this. And it outlines exactly the step-by-step motions as to what should be happening within a diagnostic assessment within Australia. You can access this here. It is written for health professionals, but certainly it's also there to be read by families so they can understand what to expect. But there are some key messages when you're going along this pathway. The first one is don't wait. If you have queries, if you have concerns, if you have worries, or if you're anxious, follow up. It's really it's really important that you follow your gut with these things and that if you have concerns, then you do go seek a health professional's advice. The second one is that your child, your family, and your circumstance is unique. No one knows that more than you. And so if you are interacting or engaging with health professionals who are not understanding the uniqueness of your situation, it's important that you do find a health practitioner who does, because that is so critical to understanding your beautiful child and the context in which they live. Finally, I want you to be laser focused on supports, therapies. How do we best support that child? Often, because of the challenges in understanding how to get to a diagnostic assessment, we get so focused on that diagnosis as the key aim of the whole process. Actually, the key aim is how do we support that child? And you don't need to wait for a diagnosis to receive support to that child. Understanding that a child might be struggling is enough in and of itself for that child to go out and receive support through a speech pathologist, occupational therapist, clinical psychologist, and more. Laser focused on supports. Okay, What a resource that you can access in the meantime is this resource called Autism What Next. It's created by Autism Awareness Australia. I sit on the board of Autism Awareness Australia, and it's a fantastic organisation. There's a lot of advocacy work there, and they've created this resource which provides a lot of information and it's tailored to you in regard to what stage you are at in the process. So people who might be exploring what autism is and is not and the way forward, people who are seeking a diagnostic assessment, and gives a breakdown of those avenues state by state within Australia, what to do after a diagnosis, and particularly that first year after a diagnosis, which can be really a new existence. And then what do we do after that? How do we best support kids and families living with autism as well? And if that's your circumstance, then it talks about that for you. So I really recommend that you do access that. Okay, so that's the general overview of what a diagnostic pathway looks. As I mentioned, I can't go into further detail as it relates to you because it is different, but access that Autism What Next, and it will provide tailored information for you and your circumstance. So the focus of the presentation here is about when you're at that point of considering whether to pursue an assessment, what goes through your mind? You must have so much circling around all your mind. And what I'd like to do is provide some information to help inform you at that point. That's what I really want to focus on here. So for families, what you might like to consider at that point, should not pursue an assessment for my child? And for clinicians, I'm hoping that I can provide you a perspective, my perspective. You obviously have your own perspective. This is a different perspective, or it might be different, that might help inform your own understanding and provide you some new language that you can also help families with. So the first thing I'd like to start on is to help you understand exactly what an autism diagnosis represents. Okay. So what is a diagnosis? I'm very lucky enough to work at the Kids Institute Australia, which has research groups that are assessing a range of different health conditions and disabilities. And so we really get a very good understanding of how diagnosis is defined and used across a very broad range of childhood. Now, in the very strictest sense, a medical diagnosis, so a diagnosis for a medical condition, the very strict definition is it's the process of identifying a disease, condition or injury from those signs or symptoms. Now, it's a very medical thing, of course, but a couple of things conditions that really help you understand that is through diabetes. So an inability to control blood sugar, that's your sign or symptoms, and then you do further follow-up tests, and a diabetes diagnosis is provided. Migraines is another great example because, of course, migraines is not just a headache. It provides even more clarity beyond a headache around aura, etc. And then those signs and symptoms then go back to the diagnosis. So in those senses, it's a really helpful way of saying that this is what we have and this is how we can hopefully support it going forward. So should we think of autism in the same way that we think of an autism medical diagnosis? So the couple of things about those medical diagnoses is, number one, it's a generally fixed definition. This is how it is. This is the biological observation we have. And then secondly, it's biological in nature. And so what I really want to put to you right up front is that we should not be thinking about autism in the context of a medical diagnosis, not just because our cultural understanding has evolved, but certainly because of that, but also because it doesn't fit the definition of what a medical diagnosis is. And I'll get onto that. So let's first look at, is autism a fixed definition? In the sense that it's relatively fixed over time and it doesn't really change. And again, I'm going to say to you right now, no, the diagnosis of autism, our definition, has changed dramatically over time. So just so you remember, autism was first introduced into the Diagnostic Manual in 1980. In the third edition of the Diagnostic Manual. It was revised again in 1987, and then in 1994, out came the fourth edition of the Diagnostic Manual. And again, the definition of autism radically changed. I'll show you how in a bit. Then, 19 years later, in 2013, the 5th edition of the Diagnostic Manual came out, and our definition of what autism was also changed again. Let me show you in more detail. So this was the 1980 definition. These are the sets of things that needed to be seen and observed for a child to be diagnosed with autism. And the first thing you'll see there is a couple of things. Firstly, a pervasive lack of responsiveness and gross deficits in language development. Of course, this is language we just simply would not use now. What it does describe is a child with quite profound disability, a child who may not be meeting milestones, and particularly in the context of language, but also we often saw intellectual different disabilities as well as motor movement disabilities. But what you see there is a really a description of a child with quite profound disability. That's what happened in 1994. So it went from this very quite constrained diagnosis to this. The basic gist of what happened is that we recognised that actually children can show those core behaviours of autism, but actually have intellectual abilities either within normal limits or well above normal limits. Same with language. Children didn't have to not develop language to show those core behaviours of autism. Actually, a child could be quite verbal or use spoken language and also meet those criteria for autism. And that's what this change recognised. It recognised that actually a child might have profound disability, but they also may not. Okay. Then what happened is in 2013, we changed it again. And that was essentially a slight change that really emphasised more of some of those sensory differences that we observe very often in children with autism. And as I want to show you, it has evolved considerably over these ages. So the important thing to say is that unlike, say, your diabetes or migraines, autism is not a fixed concept, in inverted commas. Instead, it has actually changed quite dramatically over time, both in terms of having different labels, so 1980 childhood autism, and now, of course, autism spectrum disorder, but also in terms of who we diagnosed. So, for example, in 1994, it was not possible to receive a diagnosis of both autism and ADHD. You couldn't do that. You could only receive a diagnosis of one. Similarly, it was very rare for adolescents and adults to be diagnosed based on the criteria. Now, of course, this is quite common. So there was over time, there's been a dramatic change in both who is diagnosed and what that diagnosis actually is. So here's the behavioural description in terms of autism right now. This is what the 5th edition of the manual is, okay? And so this is what it is currently. The second criteria I want you to think about in terms of a medical diagnosis is this is the behavioural description, but does that represent also a biological description? And the answer right up front is no, is that yes, this is a behavioural, there's these behavioural things, but that doesn't actually map onto a clear understanding of biology. Let me explain. So what we knew, and up until about the late 1970s, autism was actually thought to be related to environmental differences within the household. What happened in the late 1970s is there was this groundbreaking study that actually showed, hang on here, autism is actually genetic in nature. And of course, that revolutionised our understanding and was really a mark in time that said there was a before that time and an after that time. Of course, we're living in that after time. Now, of course, let me explain how that happened. Twin studies. Twin studies are an amazing kind of bit of science. And please just let me indulge me for a sec, because I love talking about this. There are two sets of different types of twins, okay? The first is those on your, I can't even remember what they are, left, I think it is for you. I'm trying to do it in the mirror. We have identical twins. Now, identical twins share 100% of their environment because they're raised in the same house, and 100% of their DNA, their genetic clones. Then there are fraternal twins, okay? So they share, if they're raised in the same house, they share 100% of their environment. And but in terms of DNA content that they share about 50% of the DNA between co-twins, just like typical siblings. Now, what we do in twin studies is we go out to the whole, to a geographical area, let's say the whole of Australia, and we say, let's find all of those twins where one or both of those twins have a diagnosis of autism. And then what we do is we calculate the concordance. If one twin has autism, what's the percentage chance that the other twin also has autism? Okay. Now, in the context of fraternal twins, if one twin has autism, it's about 5 to 18% chance that the other twin will also meet criteria for autism. In the context of identical twins, it's at 60 to 80%. If one twin has autism, it's a 60 to 80% chance that the other twin has autism. Now, what's the differences between the two sets of twins? It's the amount of genetic content that they share with their co-twin. And because the identical twins share 100% of DNA compared to the fraternal twins, which is 50%, we understand that that increase in concordance is due to genetics. And that's what was discovered in the late 1970s. And it really changed the field. It said, we understand now that these children developing differently, this is due to differences in their genetics. So, big revolution. And then what was going to happen is that, okay, well, it's a clear biological thing. But hang on, I said it's a clear biological. I said it wasn't before a biological thing. That's not. Autism is clearly a biological based condition, but what happens is actually the biological pathways that lead to that child developing autism is actually really, really different. Okay, so what happened we examined DNA by taking blood or saliva, running it through a machine, and then what it comes out is it tells us all of those 3 billion DNA variants that sit within the genome. And then, of course, you get a big nerd like me, actually even bigger nerd than me, to go through the data to start to understand. Now, what did we find once all of this technology started to emerge? Well, actually, we found that there are dozens, if not hundreds of different genes that are related to autism, but may not necessarily, in fact, are almost certainly not the same between different children with a diagnosis of autism. So what we started to understand is that actually that a diagnosis of autism relates to many, many different biological pathways, because the genetics influence how the brain develops, and actually that there is no consistent biological pathway difference. So we might hear a clinic and see children back to back within the clinic rooms, and actually it's almost certain that what the biological pathways that led to that child receiving a diagnosis of autism are fundamentally quite different. And that's been a very clear finding. So the key points that I wanted to get you out there is that autism is not the same as a medical diagnosis for a couple of reasons. The first one, it's a behavioural description. What we are saying is that there is a relatively similar cluster of children with a relatively similar cluster of behaviours that we feel needs a description so we can better support them. And that's what autism is. The other thing is that the behavioural description does not describe biology. Yes, autism is a biologically based difference, but there is no consistent biological pathway that leads to autism in every human. Okay, that's a really important thing. So when we're talking about a diagnosis, we're talking about behaviour. It's not telling us much, if anything, about the biology that sits under those behaviours. Okay, so what then is autism? Look, as I said, in its most literal form, a diagnosis represents a description of behaviours. Okay, a description of behaviours where we say, there's a group of children or individuals who are showing a relatively similar cluster of behaviours, and it's important that we name that. It's important that we name that because the purpose of a diagnosis is to help people. It's to help you, it's to help me, and it's to help others support that beautiful child to be whoever they want to be. And that's what I want to spend the rest of the talks on. So let's talk about exploring an autism assessment. So as I mentioned, an autism diagnosis is a description of behaviours which is there to help people. Now, why do we provide a diagnosis? Traditionally, I have always seen it with two different main aims of a diagnosis. The first one is looking backwards. So I'll do it this way for you. It's looking backwards. When a family comes and sees us, what we say is that that family has been on a journey to that point, and often they're coming without a huge amount of understanding or a real confusion as to how, why their child is developing differently. And what a diagnosis can do is provide that understanding of all the past experiences that they've got to that point. Now, that is super important. It's important because that has been their experience with that child, and there is nothing more important, nothing, than the connection between the child and that family. And to help that, give that family that understanding, helps that connection in many, many different aspects. So firstly, traditionally, diagnosis has been backward looking to help make sense of what has come to that point. Secondly, the way that I've always seen it is firstly understand the journey, and secondly, it's about informing the way forward. It's that actually what we can do is by providing that diagnosis, we can learn from all of the previous research, all of the previous experiences that have occurred on children with a similar diagnosis, and therefore similar in certain behaviours, in certain developmental pathways to my child. So firstly, it narrows and refines support options, certainly at the point of diagnosis. Without a doubt, beforehand and afterwards as well, you are whacked with, here's your support options. You could go this way, this way, this way, this way, this way. At the point of diagnosis, once we understand that a child receives a diagnosis of autism, all of a sudden that is refined down, and that can be extremely helpful because we say all of our previous experiences and research has said that this path may be the best way to support your child, not this, this, and this. Second one, it might help you anticipate future needs. Lots of, what can we learn from the millions and millions of people who've had an autism diagnosis previously, and what can we learn from their experiences, particularly as the child goes into school, transitions across to high school and transitions out again. What about some of the health needs that that child might have? Can we anticipate any employment needs that that child would have? Future housing needs, aging needs, all of those things we can learn from other people who have received a diagnosis of autism. And then finally, it provides that common language. It is never underestimate how important it is to have a common language that we can talk about, that firstly, you can talk with others about who have been and have supported thousands of autistic kids throughout their professional lives, but also a language in which you can describe that with your family, a language with which you can describe that with your community and support network. All of these are super critical that can flow from a diagnosis. So traditionally, two things. Firstly, looking backwards, understanding the journey to that point, and then secondly, looking forward, informing that way forward. But, or maybe the purpose of diagnosis has also evolved beyond this, okay? So it is certainly still about understanding the journey to that point. It is also about informing the way forward. But two further purposes have also evolved over time. The first one is about the identification of a community and also an identity. And I want to talk about that because it's a really important purpose that has evolved throughout my professional life, and I found it very, very interesting. Second, it's around, there's a fourth one around access to services. Now, and this one's a really important one to talk about because it's a purpose that has again evolved over time due to flaws of systems. I don't think it's helpful in any way, shape or form, but it still exists. So let's get into that. Firstly, community and identity. So community identity is something that simply did not exist. Sorry, the purpose of community and identity in relation to diagnosis is something that simply did not exist when I started in the field 25 years ago. But what it has, it's emerged out of a couple of things. Firstly, well, probably I'll go to the second point first. Firstly, the history of autism has meant that actually that first wave of diagnosis, in large numbers in the late 1990s, those individuals, those autistic kids, are now, of course, autistic adults. And they have been absolutely instrumental, building on the shoulders of disability advocates for many, many decades to create, promote the neurodiversity movement, which has really revolutionised our understanding and certainly the community understanding of autism and other neurodivergences as well. And it says that we should cherish differences, that autism is a neurodifference, and that we should cherish that as much as any other difference within our society. And what that has done is provided a pride within the diagnosis and actually has helped and people identify a community that we have a pride of as to our autism diagnosis, and that we should be loud and proud of it. Now, of course, that has helped people find people who are similar to them, and out of that has emerged a community. And from that community, of course, also emerges identity, and it goes both ways. We are who we hang out with. We are who is surrounded by us, who we are surrounded by. That is what our identity in a large part is. And that community and identity has evolved over time to, particularly in the context of adult diagnosis, but also adolescent diagnosis and sometimes child diagnosis, that a diagnosis is really important to help identify a community and help support the identity development of that child, adolescent, adult as an autistic person. And that's a really important purpose that has evolved over time. Finally, another purpose has evolved over time, and this is access to services. Access to services has historically played a role when it comes to autism diagnosis. When we started, again, when I started around 25 years ago, a diagnosis to help to help systems like education systems or disability systems understand which children require support. You have a diagnosis and therefore that is telling us that you require support. That was really commonplace. What has happened over time is that as our autism diagnosis has expanded over time, so we're children who are diagnosed with quite significant and profound disabilities, as well as children who may not have as much disability or day-to-day functional disability as other children, the diagnosis of autism as access to services has still remained. And what that has meant is that access to a diagnostic assessment has acted as access to support. And that has provided all sorts of challenges. The first one is that actually the wait lists to access a diagnosis has really gone through the roof because it is a means of that child receiving support. I think this has been a really a challenging aspect of our community because of systems, because as I said at the start, we need to be laser focused on supports. And if a child is showing disability, irrespective of whether they have a diagnosis of autism, they require support. And having families having to jump through hoops to find that diagnosis simply to access support creates all sorts of challenges for everyone, including those systems. Nevertheless, it still remains in many systems that having a diagnosis of autism allows access to supports. You have a diagnosis, therefore our system will provide you support, and also the amount of support as well. This is changing. Without a doubt, this is changing, and systems are recognising the flawed approach that this has, but nevertheless, it does still remain to a certain extent. Okay, so these are the four ways, four essentially benefits that people often come thinking about a diagnosis. Understanding the journey to that point, informing the way forward, the identification of community identity, and of course access to services, as I mentioned later. So there's some of the potential benefits, but what about some of the potential drawbacks that people often cite? The first one is, of course, stigma and discrimination. The stigma and discrimination has, without a doubt, within the Australian community has decreased significantly over time. And as I mentioned, that's been driven by amazing disability advocates who have reinforced the pride that can come with an identification with neurodivergence. But nevertheless, without a doubt, we can expect that stigma and discrimination still does exist, subtly in many aspects, in some aspects also overtly. And that might come out particularly in the workplace. It might come out in health systems. It might come out in other systems as well. It's often something that is raised quite a lot by families from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds as a potential drawback of a diagnosis within this area. The second one is that actually that seems like a whole lot of effort, and my child is actually really well supported without a diagnosis. And really this boils down to what will that diagnosis actually provide my child and my family above and beyond what the well supported that they are receiving now. The second one is the financial costs. There is no doubt about it, is that that diagnosis can be an expensive process, and that many families may not be able to afford that. And within the public system within Australia, the wait list can be quite long, and don't have the financial means to pursue that within a private system. And of course, that creates this inequity that we often see between families who have the means and maybe families who don't have the means. So that is something that families often raise with me. Finally, the time and emotional cost. It is going through this process is long, often, and it's not without really cutting to the core of your child, you understanding of your child, and riding those waves of interacting with health professionals, many, in fact, almost all of whom are just wonderful, loving clinicians to your child, can still take it out of you. And that is something that often families say, that I just don't know if I have this in me right now. So these are the things that I sort of hear on both sides. So how do you start to weigh these up? And again, I'm not sitting there within your circumstance. So all I can do is start to provide you a framework through which you might be wanting to apply that in your life. How do you know if it's like this or like this? And of course, these are some of the broad things that you want to consider. But if your individual circumstance is really different, and it can vary based on a whole lot of things. And these are things to think about. Firstly, your cultural background, as I mentioned. Approach to diagnosis can differ very, very significantly based on your own family history. The age of the child. I often have families who are querying an autism diagnosis in adolescence. And they got to the point where it's just like, well, what is this going to provide now? We're not right now. And sometimes it's, well, it'll provide an identity. It will help that child understand who they are as they go forward. Other times it'll be like, well, there's no point now. And that is up to a personal choice of that child and family. Thirdly, personal history. How were you raised? That's a really important thing. What was the family environment like in your house when you were growing up? That has a huge influence on how we parent, whether we like it or not, but also on how we approach disability and difference. Your personal exposure to disability will certainly play a role in terms of your desire or not to pursue further assessment. Access to resources, as I mentioned, financial resources, but also those emotional and family resources and community resources that sit around you, like the community context. That's going to be critical to your support. And you may decide that that's not for you. And of course, that's many, many more. This is just a grab bag. What I can do, while I can't tell you what to do within your circumstance, what I can do is provide a framework through which I've started to look at this decision, and to help families ask themselves questions that hopefully start to draw out that answer for you. So I always start with the North Star. When I have things circling around my head, or, just completely overwhelming my thought patterns, which happens a lot, I always say, right, let's cut this thinking short. What is our North Star here? What do we want? What do we want? What's the ultimate thing that we want for our child? Okay, what is it we're trying to do here? And for me, you can think about all sort of sexy type terms in terms of thriving, flourishing, flowery terms that really, for me, don't provide enough tangibility. What actually do we want for our kids? And while what I'll show you now may not be those flowery, beautiful terms that we all want, what I think it is tangible. And that is this. What I think we want for our kids, our own kids, but also with regards to our kids that we see professionally, is that we want those children to grow up to be in a position where they are empowered to have the opportunity to do whatever they want over their own lives. We want them to have all of the opportunity, to be in a position to take any opportunity that they want as their life unfolds. For me, while it might, I of course want my child to flourish and my children to flourish and thrive and all those kind of things, when I draw it down, I want them to be in a position that when an opportunity arises, they are empowered, they have the skills, they have the opportunity, they have the resources around them to decide whether to take that up or not themselves. Okay, so with all that in mind, what is the guiding question? What is the guiding question when we need to make decisions? For me, it's about, will this open or close opportunities for my child? I do this with my own kids. I do this with kids as I talk to, and families that I talk to as well. Is that our job is to open up as many opportunities we can for those children, so they can accept or reject whichever path they want to go on. So will this, whatever this is, open or close opportunities for my child? So what contributes to the well-being of the child? It's where we live, we are social beings who live within a family, a community, a society and culture. These are the different layers that contribute to giving kids opportunities. So I want to go through these in turn. Here's a little rubric that I sort of mocked up. And these are things that I think about when speaking with families as to whether they might like to pursue an assessment to understand more about their child. Firstly, on the child level, remember that's that really inner circle. The child themselves, does it provide them, so safety and security, is that in terms of thinking about a diagnostic assessment, could a diagnostic assessment or the information that comes from that assessment help keep my child safe and secure? And of course, think really lateral about that. Safe and secure within the home, safe and secure with us as a family, safe and secure within the school environment. And the skills and quality of life, could this help, could the diagnostic assessment and the information that comes from that support my child's skill development and quality of life? So when opportunities arrive, they are able to take those opportunities. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And identity, that child, that sort of core, it's amazing to see kids' identity develop over their age. And of course it develops in fits and starts and it comes this way and that way and the other. But certainly a diagnosis of autism may be core to their identity. And so will the information that comes out to that, will it help the child understand who they are now and in the future? Okay, we'll go to the family thing, because the family thing is the next onion layer. So understanding and connection. I mentioned before that you as parents and caregivers, your interaction with that child is the ball game. It's not the icing on the cake, it's the cake. Can this information that comes from an assessment help you connect with your child? Can it help you understand your child? Can it help you support them in the home environment better? Can it also help you advocate for your child's needs as well? I often think that this is something that is underplayed far too much, is that we are thinking about the child. Of course, they are the first and foremost in our mind. But when they're kids, what is the greatest enabler? It is you as parents, caregivers, as siblings, as the family network. Could this connection, could this information that comes from this help you connect with your child so you can help them take up opportunities when they might arise? And third, community. Community is just about the biggest protective factor that we have to help healthy, happy kids become healthy, happy adults. One of the things that we've lost, it has reduced over time in our modern community is our connection with community. And of course, school plays a really critical role to connecting that community. But what I can say is that families that tend to thrive throughout this time are connected with a community who understands, loves them, supports them, cherishes them, and nourishes them. So firstly, in terms of community, will the information that comes from an assessment, could this help that community understand the child's need? Can it help them actually be connected within that community because of this information? Could this help others create environments that supports your child? For example, would a diagnosis or a label, a common language, would that help at the footy club? Would it help them connect at guides or at Cubs? Could it also help them within the school environment? Of course, as well. And then connection. Could this help strengthen a child's connection with a different community, such as the autistic or neurodivergent community, that maybe they was not available to them at that point? And that often comes into play during adolescence and beyond. I really want to say that I've framed this in a way that has tended to indicate that perhaps the answer is yes. Equally often, the answer will be no. And so it's really important that your unique circumstance, nobody else experiences, and only you will be able to answer these questions that are put in front of you. And it's really important that you think about it, because in many chances, many times the answer will be no. Just as often the answer will be yes, and weighing them all up. So I'm coming to the end now. Look, a final thought, and I think I just really wanted to say this out loud at the end, is that a diagnosis doesn't change a child. The child in front of you is the same person they were before, during, after, the day they were born. The information from an assessment can be is helping you to know how to open up opportunities for that beautiful child within front of you. The other thing to say is that accurate diagnosis is key. Often in the area, because of the gateway that often a diagnosis provides towards accessing support, we have seen I've seen in the community a diagnosis at all cost type mentality. If the child doesn't receive this diagnosis, how are they going to get support? Accurate diagnosis is so important. And in that breath, I want to say that many children won't meet autism criteria, and it doesn't make them more than or less than or anything. It just means that they're falling the other side. We're not seeing all of those behaviours that I showed you right up front. But what it does mean is that the same messages that I've shown you through today applies. Our job as parents, as carers, as clinicians, is to ask the question, will what we're doing here open up opportunities for them, or will it close off opportunities? Because our job, how I see it, is to be there to open up opportunities so when they arise for that child, they will be able to make the decision themselves.